So on section 7.3, it's like really a lot of definitions and just like them stating things that are like, remember this? Wasn't that hard? So I'm just sort of gonna walk you through it because it's not the most like new learning kind of a deal. So I'm just gonna kind of like read it to you as we go, but everything's already written out. So I'm just gonna explain it that way you don't have to read the chapter. Um, so this chapter starts by saying, okay, we're gonna use some general coordinates and just look at how they would look if we didn't use the Lagrange equations. And so what that's doing is that's right here. It's basically saying that there's a whole bunch of position vectors out there in the world um, for whatever certain dimensions you would like to use. And the number of position vectors is going to be to alpha. It's going to go all the way to n. And n is, like we've used it before, it's the number of particles or objects, I guess. So then from that, you're going to have Q, which is a number of like equations and just like general equations to solve. And that is going to be reliant on your R, and you're going to go from Q1 through lowercase n. So basically, the second one will help out with the first one, and the first one will help out with the second one. They're just sort of two equations that exist together. So to make much better sense of that than whatever that was, the book brings up a pendulum, and so it starts off with a double pendulum, but we're gonna look more at a simple pendulum first, which is this equation right here. So this would be the position equation for your average pendulum. And then when you're looking at a double pendulum, which is what I have sketched out here, you use this right here. So you want an alpha value of 1 and an alpha value of 2. And you end up getting these two. So the first alpha value is just this first string. So the position of the first ball, it, it just relies on that ball. Like it doesn't care about the other one. But the second ball on the end of the second string, it cares about the position of the first ball and about its own position. So uh, the first ball is selfish; it only cares about itself, and the second ball, it's got a good balance. So it cares about itself a lot, but it also is like, I care about others too. So that's kind of how that ended up. And then, so what this is really pointing out is how complicated things can look in a Newtonian method, which is just like Newton's equations of motions. Um, it's this chapter is really made me like, oh, wasn't this gross? Um, and then give you some definitions. So the next example it brings up is an example to prove a point that in the Newtonian approach, you want to pick your axis so that it creates a simple answer. And for that, it uses a pendulum and a cart. So anything having to do with the pendulum is highlighted in yellow, and anything having to do with the motion of the cart, I highlighted in blue. Basically, the cart is accelerating and there's pendulum swinging, so the position of the ball is going to rely on, with like a total position of the world kind of vibe, it's going to rely on that acceleration of the cart and the motion of the pendulum. So that's what we have written out over here. Is It's pretty simple to follow with the colors, and then you want to remember that this equation we got for the pendulum is basically this equation that we have up here, just so you know where we got it from. And then this basically states that we just now have it in terms of theta and t, because we like polar coordinates for pendulums because they work in polar coordinates, and that's how logic works. So this next part is a bit of definitions. So I have them written down, but I'll try to explain them in different words. So degrees of freedom is basically whatever can vary, but not be the thing that changes. So if you have something that changes over time, like position in 3D space, then X is affected by T, Y is affected by T, and Z is affected by T. So that's 3 degrees of freedom because all of those are affected by T and rely on T. So T doesn't count as a degree of freedom, but the stuff that it affects do. And so a quick example of that is like the simple pendulum. So if this wasn't in a cart and it was just swinging, that only has 1 degree of freedom. So yes, X and Y change, but we're really looking at it as in terms of like polar coordinates, like we have right up here. And that's basically just means that theta changes. Theta is the only thing in there that relies on time to change. The length of the string won't change, the mass won't change, just theta will change. But then when we introduce this double pendulum up here, we now have 2 thetas that can change over time, and therefore we have 2 degrees of freedom. So that's kind of the simplest way to put it, and that's why I had to do 2 pendulum problems. So then it goes into a bit of definitions. So a constrained system is kind of like in the pendulum. So I'd consider so the pendulum is constrained because if you think about it, it's attached to the string and it can only move in that certain way. It can't. It doesn't have all the degrees of freedom that it could have. So this is kind of like the best one, but as long as it's constrained in such a way so that it can't move in 3 dimensions, it's constrained. And then and that can be done for any pendulum, even in like 3D space. So if I were to fling the pendulum ball, it would still go with it would still lie on a plane. It just might be a different plane than X, Y, and Z, so long as the motion is constant, which basically means that it's in circular motion, acting like a pendulum. The other one is a holonomic system, and that's basically any system that has the same number of degrees of freedom as its general coordinate, or like the general coordinates needed to describe it. So basically, if I have 3 degrees of freedom and 3 sets of coordinates, I'm golden. That's basically 3D motion in a nutshell. But then it adds a little hitch to that. So the book gives you an example of a non-holonomic system, and it also is in 3D motion, but it takes into account something more. So here we have a ball rolling on the floor. So this floor is going to be this plane of X and Y. And so what we do is we launch this ball down this path, and then this path, and then this path. And so it's back at its starting point. But the thing is, if I were to put a dot on this ball, that's no guarantee that the dot would end up at the same spot it was over here, because the ball I'm allowing to roll freely. So it can rotate in any of the 3 dimensions, and as well as moving along the XY axis. So what that then creates is that it has 2 general coordinates of X and Y as it's rolling along on the axis, as it moves along on the axis. But then since I'm allowing it to roll, the ball can roll in any 3-dimensional way, and therefore it has 3 more general coordinates to its motions. That's the total of 5 general coordinates. But we only have 2 degrees of freedom. So the general coordinates we have is greater than the degrees of freedom. And that makes the problem intense. And then the author dropped it like it was hot and was like, I don't want to do it, so we're not going to do it. But it's just a nice thing to know, just in case. So that you know kind of more of how the world works, the author does say that like the Lagrange approach is a bit better, but doesn't really go much into it. And then the main takeaway from this all was that the evolution in time, so basically how the coordinates change in time, is dependent on this Lagrange, um, on the Lagrange equations. So 1 through n of this right here, which is kind of what we've been brushing up on for the last couple sections. And then the next section is just going to be a proof on this. And that'll explain a lot more of the Lagrange or Lagrange way of going about it and how that works. So that's pretty much it. If you still have questions, they're probably going to be answered in the next section. And the next section is mostly mathematical.